And we want to pick up tonight on looking at more on the existence of God. We're going to hit a few things, and to me, this is one of the interesting, more. I just like some of the science things. So tonight we're going to touch on a few of those. I would say if you are taking the class for credit, just keep on your radar. 2 weeks from tonight will be the first exam, and the plan for that evening is we'll have about an hour discussion, and then at 7 o'clock, instead of taking our break, we'll let the students that are auditing the class jump off, and then the students that are taking the class for credit, I will get you an exam, and we'll spend the rest of our night that night with that exam. And so that's the plan. Remember, that's 2 weeks from tonight. And then keep on your radar too, on the 5th of October, we are going to have a guest speaker. His name is Mike Houts, Dr. Michael Houts. He's from the Alabama area. And Michael Houts is really an interesting character. He's going to come and talk to us about the age of the earth and assumptions that people make about the age of the earth. And he is a NASA scientist and really interesting guy, was an atheist for many years and eventually came out of his atheism, obeyed the gospel, and now he challenges fellow scientists in these areas, but a really likable guy. And so I hope you'll be making plans to be here for that. And also we want to get the word out on him as far as we can. And so if you know somebody that might be interested in that, we'll be happy to share. I think Zoom will let us host up to 100 people in this version, and so we'll try to get the word out and let folks know as much as we can about that. And so this is that's one of those discussions where he presents some special expertise, given his he's got a PhD from MIT, which is one of the most prestigious schools in the nation in engineering. He's a nuclear engineer, and so he works in NASA's, I think, in some research aspect of NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab. And so he understands some complex stuff. He's co-authored, I think, over 100 or maybe more technical papers. And so we're really looking forward to him. But he can put things in ways that are easy to grasp, and he doesn't fly over everybody's head and things like that. So we're really looking forward to that. That'll be on October 5th. So looking forward to those moments coming soon. And so time in the class is quickly passing by, and I hope you're enjoying it as much as I'm enjoying teaching it. So tonight we want to talk about the design argument and for the existence of God. And I'm going to try to share that with you. Bear with me just a moment. Okay, so can you see it? Can you see it on your screen there? Hopefully everyone can see the slides there. And we want to share some of that with you this evening. So we want to talk about the design argument for the existence of God. Well, if we were to break it down, in everyday life, we reason with cause and effect. If we see a painting, we readily admit that painting didn't just kind of explode into existence. We admit very readily that a painter that had some skill was able to lay some things out on a canvas, and we are able to enjoy that. So we reason from design to designer. If you observe architecture and you're looking at some of the Frank Lloyd Wright exhibits or things like that, you see the handiwork of in architecture, you'll readily admit that there was an architect behind it. When you walk into a house and you observe the structure of the house and the roof and the floor and all that goes into building a house, you readily admit that there's a builder. And so we see this, we readily move from design to designer in so many areas of life. And so there was a quote by the late Stephen Jay Gould, and Gould was a Harvard evolutionary biologist. And he said, before Darwin, we thought that a benevolent God had created us. And that's really interesting that Darwin is given so much credence or credit with the undermining of belief in a creator. And so, okay, Mrs. Miriam, you're having trouble with your microphone? Oh, I see that. You'll have on the very bottom right of your screen, Miriam, you will have a little speaker there. Make sure that speaker's turned on, and then you should be able to hear us. I don't see on our end where you're muted, but I could be muted on your end, and so just make sure that that microphone, that little speaker is up and running there. So
I don't see a microphone on her system.
Okay.
I think she had her hand raised accidentally, and
Okay.
I just put it down.
Okay. I see. She had mentioned there in the chat, Dave, that she couldn't hear me, and so maybe she's wrestling with.
I'll give her a call.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay, so when we talk about design, I want us to see that not every scientist in the past, it was against theology or opposed to theology in various ways. Johannes Kepler said this: I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him. So he worked, I believe, if I remember right, with planetary motions and things like that. And he says, I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him. Since we astronomers are priests of the highest God in regard to the book of nature, it benefits us to be thoughtful, not of the glory of our minds, but rather above all else of the glory of God. So this is fascinating because, Kepler is not just an armchair scientist. He's credited with some important things in
Daniel, Kepler
yes,
was the one that discovered that the orbits of the planets were not circular but elliptical.
Okay.
And so it was his discovery that answered a whole lot of questions that things weren't making sense until he realized that it was an elliptical orbit.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that with us, Mary. And so another famous quote from Isaac Newton: though these bodies may indeed continue in their orbits by the mere laws of gravity, yet they could by no means have at first derived the regular positions of the orbits themselves from those laws. What's Newton saying? He's saying that there is this gravitational pull between bodies in our solar system, but he is calling attention to what initially put them in that orbit. And so you could by no means have at first derived the regular positions from those laws. Thus, this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. Now, Newton is no armchair scientist, right? And and he's giving credit to glory in creation, to something that exists beyond creation. Robert Boyle, he says, "'Tis like a rare clock, such as may be that at Strasbourg, where all things are so skillfully contrived, that the engine being once set a moving, all things proceed according to the artificer's first design, and the motions of the little statues that at such hours perform these or those things do not require." And so he is calling attention again to an artificer's design. Now, in the world tonight, we have individuals who deny the existence of God and who say that, we really can explain our world from scientific explanations, and we really don't need to give God any credit or glory. But here are some scientists that are pointing to God and his work in our world. One famous individual that's sometimes quoted when we think about design is an individual by the name of William Paley. William Paley lived in the late 1700s, And he was famous for a book written in 1802 called Natural Theology. And in that, he is popularized with this idea of what's called the watchmaker argument. Well, the watchmaker argument kind of goes like this. If you're walking along a path and you hit your foot upon a stone, would you reason that that stone had always been there? Well, we may look at a stone and say, well, that stone could have come from, a flood, or it could have moved from various positions in time, or positions on our planet, depending on, weather or certain things like that. But then he says, if you're walking along a path and you look down and there's a watch, would you reason that that watch had always been there? The answer, he says, is quite obvious. You would reason that someone undoubtedly had dropped it, right? You wouldn't reason that it just kind of poofed into existence or spontaneously appeared there. You would believe that watch came from someone who previously had owned that watch or misplaced that watch, or somehow it had departed from its owner at some point in the historic past. So why then, when you hit your foot upon a stone, would you reason that an object like a stone had always been there? If you were to look at a watch, you see a chain, a pocket watch at least, you would see a chain and an hour hand and an elastic spring and a flexible chain and wheels with teeth. And after all this thoroughgoing examination, you would reasonably conclude that the watch had a watchmaker. And we say, well, this seems pretty obvious. Why are we spending time talking about moving from a watch to a watchmaker? Well, one of the reasons is that some people, they don't recognize or admit design, and yet design is screaming out at them. It's so many facets of our world all the way, all around us. And so we would say, okay, and we used this illustration, I think it was last week, where we looked at an artificial hand, and we looked at a natural hand, and we would admit that it took a lot of intelligence and design to make an artificial hand. But then when we look at a natural hand, why would we conclude that wasn't designed, when so much intelligence and time and energy and things like that go into an artificial one? I get fascinated in Warner Robins, and maybe some of you do in Middle Georgia too, with flight. I've just lived here over 2 years. I'm in my third year here at Warner Robins, and I get fascinated sometimes because I'll hear the planes, but I won't see them. And occasionally I'll get kind of giddy. I'll get kind of excited because, there's a jet, right? You'll hear it, and then you're looking for it, and, it's this, the sound is following the jet. When you think about an airplane and the amount of design that goes into, an F-16 or an F-22 or one of these fascinating planes we have in our Air Force, there are teams and teams of designers and tons of brain power going into, and you've got different engineers that are working on different facets of that plane. You've got aeronautical engineers, and you've got, electrical engineers and mechanical engineers, and, all different sorts of engineers that are coalescing their ideas together to create, this extraordinary piece of machinery. And, but then when we look at the natural world, is it so far-fetched to, in my life, I've seen drones come on board, right? So here's this drone that's flying, and now, there's lots of discussion about drones and things like that. But, you look at the way that a drone can fly, and then you look at a hummingbird. A hummingbird's been hovering and staying in its particular place and for a lot longer than we've had drones. And so, if we admit design in in humanly created things, is it so difficult to admit design in natural things? And a lot of times what we see is people mimicking, and it's called biomimicry, where scientists and engineers will observe things in the natural world, and they'll try to design, you know, airplanes and other things, so that they can have exquisite properties that exist in the natural world. A lot of people get very wealthy off those designs. And so we see that it drives business, it drives technology and things like that. Well, when we think about this design argument, what we're talking about is what's called a teleological argument. So when you hear the word teleological, think design. Teleological, there's that Greek word telos, which has to do with end. Sometimes we think of end or goal associated with the word telos. So you think of teleological. And so here's this end or goal or outcome. And that's what teleological means. And what we're doing is we're arguing from purposeful design in the world to a designer. So you could state the argument this way: if the universe evinces purposeful design, there must have been a designer. The universe does evince purposeful design, thus the universe must have a designer. And so, like we studied last week with the cosmological argument, the design argument too is a cause and effect argument for the existence of God. Well, I want to share with you a few things that I think if you were to talk, let's imagine tonight, and this is really what we want to accomplish. One thing we want to accomplish in this class is imagine tonight that you were talking with an unbeliever. Imagine tonight that you were talking with someone who doesn't believe in God, doesn't accept the Bible as God's word, doesn't believe that Jesus was God's son. Imagine that you were trying to reason with them. Now, I would, like Jesus, not immediately take these people off your radar. Some people have never thought through some of these things, and some people have never had their sacred assumptions, and that's kind of weird to say when you think about an atheist, but they've never had their assumptions really challenged. They may think, well, anybody with a brain would not believe in creation. That may be where they're coming from. So don't write these people off, by, but maybe give them some time. Maybe see if they would engage you with some conversation. Now, when we think about design, I want us to think for a few moments tonight about DNA. Bill Gates has said this about DNA. He says, DNA is like a computer program, but far more advanced than any software we've ever created. This is interesting. One of the wealthiest men, founder of Microsoft, tons of intelligence has been pumped into that company over the years. And, lots of people rely still on Windows and all the Microsoft products and things like that. He says that DNA is like a computer program, but far more advanced than any software we've ever seen. Well, what is DNA? I want you to see tonight that in our world, there is something that's driving life within the human cell. And that substance, that DNA, is the language of life. So DNA, DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is the chemical language of the cell. You may remember, famous pictures there of Watson and Crick, who are given credit with the double helical structure of DNA. And at the origin of life, we're talking about the origin of information. And DNA is like Gates says, it's like a computer program, but far more advanced than any software we've ever created. So Gates is admitting in the biological world that there is this substance that is driving life. And so I want to share with you just this information. By all means, feel free to raise your hand or speak up. The problem of the origin of life is clearly basically equivalent to the problem of the origin of biological information. So where did the intelligence come from for what's going on inside of one human cell. Let me try to put this in perspective for you. All right, when we talk about DNA and where it came from, if the origin of life is dealing with the origin of complex biological information, where did it come from? Where did DNA come from? Okay, no human being created DNA. It didn't end up, it's not the product of any human derived computer program. It took us in over a period of 13 years, I say us, it took scientists from all over the world 13 years in a project called the Human Genome Project to read the human genetic code. And so when we talk about DNA, we're talking about the human genome that exists in our bodies. And it is the sum of our genes. So it took 13 years to read that language. And at the end of that, what scientists had really was a complex, long sequence of A, T, C's, and G's. And at the end of 13 years, they were able to say, okay, here's the parts manual. We have the parts manual now. We don't know how it all works. There are coding regions and non-coding regions, and there's various points on certain genes. We don't understand how it all works, but we've got the code laid out. And so when you talk about the origin of life, you're talking about the origin of information. Well, where did DNA come from? Did it come, which came first? Did matter come first, right? And then mind, or did mind come first and then matter? So here's a question. Did matter exist prior to intelligence, or did intelligence exist prior to matter? So and if matter existed, then the mind, as evolution would contend for, right? It would contend that from non-life became living organisms, and this is a serious problem in evolution. This notion that matter first existed and then it evolved into consciousness or intelligence. But where did the matter come from? We really, if you admit that there's matter, you still have that explanatory problem on where did the matter come from? Did it come from nothing? Has matter always existed? And so this becomes a huge challenge when you talk about the origin of life. Now, if the mind existed and then matter, right, then we understand that intelligence put this system in place. Intelligence, that matter is the product of intelligence. Well, then who is that intelligence? We have a comment here. Have you heard of the Adam and Eve theory? Supposedly a scientist believes if you look at our DNA deep enough, we find Adam and Eve. Yeah, Leilani, you want to speak a little bit about that? I'm not that familiar with it.
I was doing a study a while back, and it was during college, and they were talking about DNA and what other people's theories were, and I forget who it was, but we came across an article in a I forget which magazine it is. It was a scientist magazine. I forget what it's called. And this man stands up and he says that science, he found Adam and Eve in the DNA in somebody's DNA, and he was like, it was like the very core being of the person, and he was going on and making like a theory that this core piece of DNA was Adam and Eve because it matched up with some other people's DNA too. So he honestly believes that you could find proof of Adam and Eve via DNA.
Huh, that's interesting. No, I'd like to read a little bit more about that.
I have the report actually locked away in some of my belongings. If I find it, I'll definitely show it to you.
Okay, yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate you sharing that. So when we talk about DNA, send a message, a text message from New York to LA. All right.
Daniel, you froze there for a moment. Not sure why.
Okay, bear with me just a second here.
Yeah, you're okay now. And I've been trying to reach Miriam. I've called a few times and I gave her my number to call me. And I'm in the same chat she is, and she's not reading it, so I don't know.
Okay. All right. Okay, thanks, Dave, for trying. Appreciate you. Okay, so when we talk about DNA, am I glitchy or anything? Can you hear me okay now?
I hear you fine, thank you.
Okay, good deal. All right. Yeah, I was, I plugged in hard to the network, so hopefully it'll be good now. Okay, so let's think about sending a text message. If you were to send a text message, what conditions would be required to send a text message from New York to Los Angeles? Think with me for just a moment about that. So it would require that you have a cell phone and that the other person have a cell phone or some device that could receive the text. It would demand that that device have power, that device be functional. It would mean that it couldn't be wet or damaged. It would mean that the battery would have to be charged at least some. It would demand that that the screen be working some way, that there be some functionality. There'd be a lot of variables on both ends to receive and communicate that message. Once you send that message, then it would also then demand that there be certain cell towers in place, that there be a way that that message could be communicated between one device to another. There are all sorts of variables that play into simply sending a text message. It would demand that both the sender and the receiver be speaking the same language. It would demand that that there be some intelligence that could lay forth that language in an intelligible way that could be understood, that they could express that language, that there could be some fine motor coordination, either to type that text out with your fingers or to speak it into your phone and hope that it gets the right words and it doesn't mess it up too much. And then on the other end, there would be the necessity for that other mind to be able to interpret that message. So think about that with me for just a moment. And so if you were to have a device like that, we would understand that there would be of necessity a communication between two minds. It would be intelligence on one end sending the message. It would take an intelligence on the other end to receive the message. So when we think about what's driving life and when we think about DNA, right? Here is a code, here is a language, here is a language that is here by intelligence. And it took human intelligence, scientists all over the world, 13 years, that ability to try to figure out that information. And so, and that's just to read the code, just to read the language of that code. So you've got a message, and DNA is kind of like a medium. It's a language that we've been able to read somewhat, taking a lot of intelligence over time. When you think about DNA, it's the molecular language of life. It's been called the molecule of life by the Department of Energy. It's been called a book by Francis Collins. It's been called a repository of instruction, a book of life by Francis Collins. And so these are descriptions that are given to this. Language demands a mind, and it demands sufficient intelligence to put forward the code. And then it takes intelligence to uncode the code. And so DNA, if there's no DNA, now let's be clear about this. We're not just talking about an abstract language. We're not just talking about a language that people speak in a certain community. At the very core of life, if there's no DNA, there is no life. It is the language of the cell. And so there's DNA in plant organisms, there's DNA in animal organisms, there's DNA in all sorts of biological life. But if there is no DNA, there is no life. This is the language that's driving life. Well, what's it look like? Here's what it looks like. So on the screen here, I hope you can see my cursor. There's a picture of a drawing of a depiction of the cell. Inside the cell would be these chromosomes. You would have multiple 46 human chromosomes. You would have about 2 meters of DNA. If you were to unwind DNA, you would have about 2 meters. And this is in one human cell, right? You would have about 2 meters of DNA inside one human cell. On these chromosomes, you have certain genes. These genes would be a certain portion of this DNA. And what you have with DNA, genes are about 30,000 codes, 30,000 base pairs, if you will, coding for proteins. So think about this. Genes are made up of DNA. Okay, so chromosomes would have genes on them in certain sections of DNA along this chromosome. You'd have multiple chromosomes inside the nucleus of the cell. Genes are coding for proteins, and proteins are doing all sorts of functions inside the body. Now, in a very basic way, your genes, your genome, your DNA that's given to you at when the DNA from your parents, from your mother and your father come together, that genetic code does not change throughout your life, right? Unless you get cancer or something like that. That genetic code stays intact all the days of your life. It'll code for proteins. Proteins will do all sorts of functions inside your human body. And it's the language that's driving life. So now, how long is this code? Well, it's 3.1 billion base pairs long. So you see here on the screen, there's a C and a G, a T and an A. And what scientists figured out is this. If you strip this a double helical structure along the center there, and you can read one side of the code, you know the other side of the code, right? So every time there's a C is matched with G, and this is, I think, adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, I think. And some of you can remind me if I'm wrong there. But every time you see a C, it matches up with a G. Every time you see a T, it matches up with an A. So even though you can't see the T here, this A is matched up with a T. And then all along, 3.1 billion base pairs long, you could go and go and go and read. If you could read one side of the structure, you know by default the other side. So one gene would be 30,000 base pairs, right? Coding for proteins that are driving life's functions. Well, again, here's some more information. So you've got a gene that's between 30 and 50,000 base pairs. A chromosome is about 150 million base pairs. And then you've got one set of your complete genetic makeup, and this is in one human cell, is 3.1 billion base pairs long. 3.1, that's B with the boy, as in boy, billion base pairs long. So let me put this let me draw a comparison here. So if you were to look at DNA language and you wanted to see, okay, how much information really is inside a human cell, one human cell. I just want to try to wrap my mind around how much information is in one human cell. All right, so let's do a comparison. You've got the DNA language is 4 letters, A, T, C, or G. You've got the English alphabet, 26 letters, A through Z. Okay, you've got codons, you've got genes, you've got chromosomes, and then you've got the entire makeup in one human cell, 3.1 billion base pairs. Well, if you were to put that into English novels, and I could give you my math on this. Let's say the average word is 6 letters long. One gene would be about a half to 1.5 novels. One chromosome would be about 882 novels. And so the information in one human cell would be equivalent to 18,235 novels. Now, just let that sink in for just a moment. We've got scientists who and people who listen to, you know, popular notions that are out there that are saying, well, I don't really have good reason to believe in the existence of God. All right, so how are you going to explain the complexity and the detail and the precision of information that's driving life? All right, so let's say we've got two alternatives here. We've got life is, as the Bible would speak about it, it comes from intelligence, it comes from a directed cause, it comes from wisdom, it comes from power, it comes from insight. That's what the Bible's saying. And then our other alternative is that it's coming from undirected, unintelligent, random causes. Okay, so those, let's say those are our two alternatives at the end of the day. Which one is more reasonable? Okay, so if you take the amount of information inside one human cell, 18,235 novels, that's the amount of data that's in one human cell. So the DNA in one nucleus of one cell is equivalent to 18,235 novels. How much information is that? Well, if you were to print out the message in one human cell, that 3.1 billion base pairs on 8.5 by 11 paper, and you were to stack that paper up, what you would come up with is a stack of paper that's as high as the Washington Monument. That's how much information is in one human cell. 555 feet, 5.5 inches high. That's how high the Washington Monument is. So take your stack of paper and line it all the way up. That's how much information is in one cell, one human cell. So if you were to take the human body, the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. has 29 million catalog books. If each of those were a novel, the library would have the equivalent of 1,590 human cells. 1,590 human cells. That's how much information would be in the entire Library of Congress. The human body has an estimated 100 trillion cells. So if you were to take all the information in one human body, one human being, what you're looking at is the equivalent to 62.8 billion libraries of Congress in one human being. Now let that sink in. Like just, okay, so how much information is in my body? There's so much going on inside of me that I don't think about and that we don't have to think about, but it's wisdom and it's intelligence that's driving life. And when you begin to kind of put some of these things into perspective, you think, wow, why would anyone ever concede to a notion that somehow what's driving life happened by undirected, unintelligent, random causes? Like, why would we ever get there? You know, we wouldn't say, well, the way that you send the way that text messages get sent is by random, undirected, unintelligent processes. I mean, you've got tons of engineering and tons of design and tons of intelligence that allows, you know, you have to be able to understand the language, you have to be able to communicate the language, and then the technology has to be there to deliver the medium between two minds. So DNA is the medium, right? So, okay, we've looked at this. DNA, it's this code, it can repair itself, but what if, you know, you found out that if there's no DNA, there is no DNA, there is no human life. You know, what would you think of that all important text message? So think about the options that we have when it comes to DNA. Did DNA create itself? All right, did it just into existence? Does it make sense that a language of this complicated nature, right, that Bill Gates would say it's more complicated than any program we've ever written, right? And he knows computer programming. Did DNA create itself? So, okay, let's just entertain these options, even if they're seem easily dismissed. Is DNA uncreated and eternal, or is DNA created? So let's consider those options. Did DNA create itself? Well, DNA goes through this process called replication, which means it makes copies of itself. And when you look at the cells inside your body, they make copies of themselves. And so it goes through this process called replication. So to use some language from the Bible, DNA begets DNA, begets DNA, begets DNA. There's no spontaneous, just poof into existence DNA. DNA comes from prior DNA. That makes sense, right? So a notion that DNA creates itself would seem one that could be easily dismissed. But other people may say, well, you know, could the chemistry and the physics determine the sequence of the structure? So you start looking at this double helical structure that's rotates and all of that. But the chemical attraction can't really account for the sequence. The sequence for DNA is determined outside the system. So the origin of DNA is not DNA itself. DNA did not create itself. So the physics, although it's remarkable, and the chemistry, although it's remarkable, it can't account for the sequence of the code. Our DNA comes into existence at fertilization with the joining of 23 chromosomes. DNA will eventually die. If DNA did not create itself and it's not eternal, what is the signature in the cell? The code has been read. I mean, let's make no mistake about it. The code for DNA has been read. Doesn't mean we understand everything about what the code means, but we have the parts manual. The question is, who wrote the code? If we can conclude that Microsoft is the product, or Microsoft Word is the product of programmers and software engineers, if we can conclude that in Rome, that Peter's Basilica is the work of Michelangelo, that the art in there is the product of Michelangelo, if we can conclude that man did not design himself, and if we can conclude that blind chance and undirected causes are insufficient explanation, can we conclude that God's signature is in the cell? I think we can. I don't think it's too far-fetched to see that. So when we talk about intelligent design, and we talk about moving from design to designer, I want us to see that science really is, if we take a candid look at it, science isn't necessarily the enemy of faith. We can look at some of these details and we can be amazed at the intelligence that's driving life. So one term that's used sometimes in discussion of intelligent design is this notion of irreducible complexity. Well, what does that mean? That's kind of a big phrase, a couple big words. Irreducible complexity. What's that mean? Well, irreducible complexity is a purposeful arrangement of parts where if any part is removed or mutated, the structure ceases to assemble or function properly. So what is that? What would be some examples of that? And I'm going to share with you one just in just a moment. Let me share with you this real quick, just because it's part of the PowerPoint. But intelligent design is saying that there are natural systems that cannot be adequately explained in terms of undirected natural forces, and that exhibit features which in any other circumstance we would attribute to intelligence. All right, that's a good definition of intelligent design. We see in the natural world certain attributes that demand intelligence as driving the system. If you were to look at Mount Rushmore, you wouldn't look at Mount Rushmore and go, well, that's the product of random erosion. It's the product of acid rain over a period of number of years. And, you know, acid rain, it might erode certain types of stone and things like that. But we would never look at Mount Rushmore and go, well, that's the product of random, you know, occurrences over great periods of time. We see that there was a carver, an individual who knew who these faces represented, and then went to carving them on a mountain. We would never look at that and go, well, that's the product of random, undirected, unguided processes. So when we talk about intelligent design, and we'll go back to evolution there in just a moment, we talked about this word irreducible complexity. Well, what is that? Michael Behe is a scientist who wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. And in that book, it's a fascinating read. It's older. I think it was written in 1990. But Behe is a molecular biologist, and he's really been the thorn in the flesh of a lot of very popular evolutionists, because he has the academic credentials. He can contend with them on a scientific level, and he does. And so he's kind of you know, there are a lot of scientists that aren't big fans of Behe, but Behe talks about this irreducible complexity. And what Behe writes about in this book is there is a motor, as he would call it, in a bacteria. Bacteria have a whip-like cell called flagella. Well, there is at the microscopic level, there are certain proteins that are driving this motor inside this bacterial whip-like flagella that allows bacteria to move through liquid. And so Behe says, hey, there's these proteins in there, and if these proteins inside this motor that's allowing a bacteria to propel itself through liquid medium, if these proteins fail, then this bacteria dies because it can't move around in its liquid home. And so Behe, in his book, Darwin's Black Box, he talks about this irreducible complexity, and he makes an analogy that there are certain biological systems that cannot be explained adequately by evolution. And so he uses an analogy of a mousetrap, and he says, if any of these parts on a mousetrap fail, if the platform fails, then the mousetrap fails. If the catch doesn't hold back appropriately, the mousetrap fails. If the holding bar fails, then the mousetrap fails. If the spring fails, the mousetrap fails. If the hammer that's supposed to catch the mouse fails, then the mousetrap fails. And so what Behe's saying is, if any portion in this mousetrap fails, the whole system fails. Well, what Behe says is, hey, we have biological systems that are just like that. You can't explain them. They will not allow for moderate, very small moderations over a period of time. If any of them fail, the whole system fails. And that's Behe's point. And so he will talk about, and you don't have to memorize this to go to heaven, but this is a picture of the clotting cascade. Well, when you cut yourself, you have what's called an intrinsic pathway and an extrinsic pathway. So you understand that your body will eventually allow you to clot. If you're a man and you cut yourself shaving, you know that in a very sometimes a very short amount of time, your body will clot. Well, Behe compares that mousetrap to the clotting cascade. And if you're missing certain factors in the clotting cascade, you bleed to death. You don't have time for these factors to evolve so that you can live. You either live or die in those moments. And so Behe's arguing purely from a scientific perspective. He's not arguing theology per se, but his argument certainly has theological implications. But what he's saying is that there exist in human cells and in the human body certain systems that are irreducibly complex, that if one component fails, the whole system fails. So he's arguing that what we observe in nature is irreducibly complex, and that you cannot, what he's saying is that Darwinism fails, because Darwinism, Charles Darwin's theory of a natural selection of random mutation over a period of time, cannot adequately account for these systems, that they're better explained by intelligent causes, not unintelligent causes. They're better explained by design and by intention and by awareness of outcomes, right? You think about this: if sea animals eventually developed lungs according to the evolutionary model, right? That would demand that sea-dwelling creatures would have intelligence to say, hey, there would be an advantage to breathing on land, right? So what does that mean? That means that they would have foresight, that they would have understanding, that they would have intelligence. But you see, Darwinism says it's not by intelligence, it's by random, undirected, unguided, unintelligent processes. You see, intelligence would say, even within the evolutionary structure of things, that if we, as they allegedly say, went from being sea creatures to eventually land-dwelling creatures, how many times would a whale beach itself before it would develop lungs? I mean, we understand that sometimes they will beach themselves, but they don't live for any great length of time on land when they're beached like that. So what I'm saying is that intelligence is screaming at us at so many different areas of our society. So think about this with me. When we talk about evolution, and this might be a slide that you circle and just kind of commit to memory if you're taking the class for credit. But it's important to understand what we're challenging and what we're not challenging. We're not challenging that things never change. We're not saying that the beak of a bird may never change, that the length of a horse's leg may never change, that within certain species that there are certain limitations. We're not saying, because some people will say, oh, you don't believe in evolution? And then, we may ask, well, what do you mean by evolution? Well, you don't believe things change? Well, sure, I believe things change. But evolution is not saying, merely that things change. They're saying that by unintelligent, random processes, we can end up with a complex life that we see all the way around us. And I'm saying that doesn't make sense. So what's not being challenged is that there can be limited descent. We understand that breeds can, interbreeding can cause certain functions in animals. We understand that certain genes can happen, that mutations can occur. I mean, if you look at the coronavirus right now, the COVID virus, you can see where multiple mutations happen at the genetic level that allow this virus to continue to dwell in the population. We're not saying that can't happen. I mean, we know that it's happening. We know that with antibiotics, that there are certain resistance that can occur, that bacteria over time can become resistant. So we're not denying that there's limited change. But what we're saying, what is being challenged is this notion of universal common descent, that we all came from a single ancestor. We're denying what's called blind watchmaker evolution. That is, that it just happened without intelligence, without anything such as that. And so So what we'll do is we've come to our break time. I've got just a few slides left here on this, and then we're going to jump over to our notes tonight. But let's go ahead and take our break. I see it's 7:01. And if any of you have any comments or questions, we'll entertain them now. But we'll go to break now and then come back around 7:16.
But there is, after the flu debate, or long after, there's this book that's called There Is No God, How an Atheist, I think, changed his mind or something like that.
Right.
And in it, Flu is accounting for giving reasons why he changed from being an atheist. And one of the things that he said convinced him was the structure of the DNA.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
We appreciate you sharing that with us, Eddie. Yeah, that's good. And yeah, so you can see where at least, I mean, we could give Flu credit for being honest enough to say, okay, here is a convincing reason to give up my atheism.
Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that, Eddie. Anybody else have a comment or something they want to add? Okay, if not, we will go to break and we will come back at 7:18. Sure. We had a question about the slides, and I'll show you here in the email that was originally sent out. There is this folder, and if you look right here, Sister Cheryl, there's this file right here, design, DNA, fine-tuning principles. So that's what I've shared with you all. And so you should have access to that. If you can't, if you need the password or something again.
Brother, when you look right here, we don't see what you're seeing. We just see you, your hands.
Oh, okay.
I mean, you're very good looking.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, so if you were to look here on the screen, you have this folder that you have access to, and right here there'll be a document, DNA, design DNA, fine-tuning principles. So you should be able to access it there, Sister Cheryl. So if you need the password again or need me to share that with you, just shoot me an email and I'll be happy to get that to you. But yes, you will have the access to this PowerPoint.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so let's talk about fine-tuning principles for just a moment. When we think about fine-tuning principles, another word for those is called anthropic principles. So these principles are principles that exist in the world around us that say that life, as it appears on planet Earth, was specifically designed, particularly designed that has humankind in mind. So we notice certain facets in the scientific world that demonstrate that life is finely tuned on this planet for our existence. And I want to share with you just a few of those things, but I want to share with you a Bible passage. In Psalm 8, verse 3, the psalmist says, "When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is man that you're mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea. O Lord, how majestic, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth." So the psalmist would say, when he looks at the heavens, he would say, what is man that you're mindful of me? You know, who are we? And that of all that seems to be going on in the world around us, that there are particular things that are held in place that certainly show us that life was designed particularly for this planet. And so I want to share with you a few of those principles tonight, and just to kind of whet our appetite a little bit. We see it in biochemistry, we see it in medicine, we see it in human biology, we see it in geology, we see it in the stars and astronomy. We see many things that are held in place precisely so that life can exist as it does. Now, I shared with you this last week, but at the center of the sun, we have this nuclear reaction that's going on. 600 million tons of hydrogen is converted to 594 million tons of helium. That's called a nuclear fusion reaction. And it's sending light and heat to our planet. And the amount of energy created in 1 second by the sun is equivalent to the energy that Earth will use in one entire year. And so, the fact that our major star and our solar system, that we're at a certain distance from that we're at a certain orbit around that we're protected some from its harmful effects by an ozone layer. All of these things are screaming at us that there is design that's finely tuned for life to exist on our planet. We think about the properties of water. Typically, items that are more dense will sink, and items that are less dense, but with water, the property is different in the fact that a more dense, that as a solid, it floats, right? So this is a property that's unique to water, and we could talk about what that means at, the polar regions of our planet and things about that. There is this fluid medium, the way it absorbs heat, the way it buffers living organisms from temperature change, all of this seems finely tuned and I would argue that God had us in mind. You think of the planet Jupiter. There is a certain gravitational pull that comes from the planet Jupiter that protects the planet Earth from cosmic debris. And one scientist by the name of Guillermo Gonzalez, he said if our own Jupiter had a more elliptical orbit, the Earth wouldn't be able to maintain as much of a circular orbit and have the steady temperatures and predictable climate that come with that. And so Jupiter's proximity to the Earth helps protect us from cosmic debris. And Jupiter sometimes is called the vacuum cleaner of the solar system, but it has a tremendous amount of gravitational pull, and those objects end up crashing in. Let me show you a picture here. And this is from a website called earthsky.org. But here's some brown spots on Jupiter. They mark the fragments of a comet called Shoemaker-Levy 9, but it tore through Jupiter's atmosphere back in 1994. And these are some of the spots that are left from the forces of that comet. Well, here's Jupiter protecting our planet. We're not receiving this debris and this, these harmful effects because Jupiter has an impact on our planet. So these things are fascinating. You think about gravity and how gravity exists between two bodies and how that dial is set at a specific speed of gravity and between two masses. And Earth has a gravity, the moon has a gravity, the sun has a gravity. And so there is this gravitational pull between those objects. You think about our atmosphere. There are 5 different layers to our atmosphere. And one of those, the layer that's closest to the Earth, is called the troposphere. It's about the first 11 miles of atmosphere. It's where weather cycles and wind patterns, life can exist in this area of the atmosphere. But when you go to the thermosphere, which is a higher region right before the exosphere, which is the final region. The thermosphere reaches temperatures of 3,632 degrees. And so, this life couldn't exist there, right? I mean, not at those temperatures. The glow of the northern lights, that happens because of what's going on in the thermosphere. So there's certain gas composition to our world. There is, 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, 0.03% carbon dioxide. If that oxygen level changed to 15%, we would suffocate. If oxygen increased to 25% in our solar system, fires would erupt spontaneously. So just the composition of oxygen on our planet is screaming at us that, hey, some intelligence had us in mind, because I'm able to breathe, you're able to breathe, and we have a certain ratio of oxygen in our solar system. And so carbon dioxide, if it were less, plants would not sufficiently use it in photosynthesis, and oxygen levels would be off and we'd die. If it were too high, there would be a runaway greenhouse effect and the oceans would boil. So carbon dioxide has a certain role in our solar system. Think about lightning in our solar system. If lightning increased, there would be a lot more fire destruction throughout our world. If it decreased, there would be too much nitrogen fixation in the soil. So we see that all of these things are happening in the world around us, and that seem to that are pointing that there's intelligence behind us. Okay, Miss Mary, you have a comment you want to make. Miss Mary, are you with us? Oh, you're on mute, Mary.
One thing I want to point out is that one does not have to have a scientific background or understand much about astronomy or chemistry or biology at all. Even children can notice things in our universe that make it clear that we have a creator, such as the fact that humans, if not humans, then at least animals, live on the entire surface of the earth. In other words, people can live, other than the South Pole, where I'm pretty sure they have to pack food from Walmart to go down there. Everywhere else, people can find sustenance on this planet. Also, think about beauty. Flowers. God didn't just create for us a functioning universe. He created for us a beautiful universe. In fact, flowers grow in what's that frozen part of Russia that I can't think of right now?
Siberia?
Siberia. There are flowers that grow in Siberia.
Yeah.
Music. Where did music come from? Why do we have the ability to sing? Mm-hmm. My point being that we don't have to wait for our children to be in college to start explaining some of these obvious proofs of God's existence. We can start pointing them out from the time they are small children. And that's that right. One thing that I think has taken people away from God is the fact that they're not out in nature like they used to be. Okay.
That's true. Yeah, if we're not up close and personal with it, there's some teachers in nature that are quite remarkable. I appreciate you sharing that. And you're right. You don't have to be an expert in science. Don't have to be a scientist. And the heavens declare the glory of God. And we can spend time in the natural world and see how that exists. I appreciate you bringing that up. Any other comments? Anybody want to add?
Hey, Daniel.
Yes, ma'am.
Margaret Marsh is here too with me. Got a question, and this may be off target, but when with the thing with the global warming and stuff, and that we're going to just, would they talk like we're going to destroy the earth, but wouldn't we be instead destroying man's ability to be on the earth? Because God created it. God's going to decide when he wants to do, you know, the end of time and stuff. But in the meantime, is that what they're saying, that we're going to destroy our ability to remain on this earth, or just all have to, like Mary said, kind of move to another part of the country that will sustain us? Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I think so. And I don't know if if I have enough insight to know what, to be honest, I haven't followed the talking heads close enough to find out where they're at on the issue. They are concerned with, you know, various impacts on our oceans, and, you know, the amount of trash that are in our oceans, and the impact of you know, on our ozone and things like that. But I don't know if they're predicting a fall so much as trying to be better stewards of the world in which we live in. But to be honest, I haven't followed the story line close enough. So
I haven't really. It's just that in all this, especially getting into this, if anything changes and stuff, you know, I guess it's more a matter of just if man has the ability to change these things that keep the earth, if it may still remain, but to sustain our life, I guess we could do that. Now, whether we're doing it with our actions, I'm not going to get into whether we should, you know, fossil fuel versus everything else. I'm just saying, though, that I think that's what they're trying to say, is that we would be at fault for allowing ourselves to not be able to, the earth not to be able to sustain us. And there's some people have said, listen, God's going to decide when that's going to happen. But we do things all the time as humans, things that are dangerous for us, that could kill us, and we do it, and sometimes it does kill us. So I tell Marsha, I said, if I decided to go step out in front of a car in the highway, just testing God's ability, it doesn't mean God's going to suddenly reach down and pull me back off the highway. I'm going to get hit by that car. So I kind of take an analogy there of, if you're doing things that you're putting yourself in danger. Now, I'm not being a proponent or against what they say about global warming, but in all this, it sounds like the earth's going to go on until God, you know, till God decides to change some of this or do something. But man's ability to sustain us, the earth sustain us, I don't know whether we can count on that. I just don't know. I don't have an opinion one way or the other, because I don't know how to what I think about it.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think in that discussion it's important to realize that sometimes we don't realize the impact of some things we do upon the earth, and then until much later, you know, we can look at stuff like DDT and things like that, and then we realize later, Agent Orange, you know, you look at the problems that have come with that. You know, so sometimes the certain toxic things in our, you know, can have harmful effects that we don't see till much later. And but yeah, it's certainly something. You know, as Christians, you know, we trust that you know, according to Scripture, there'll come a day when God does destroy the earth by fire, and He will come and you know, Second Peter talks about that, and you know, so we know that one day that won't be destroyed by water again. He's made that promise, but one day He will, when He's done with creation here, that'll be you know, it'll be burned up. So That's what the Bible says. So we, but yeah, any other comments tonight or observations? Anyone want to ask Margaret if she drives a Prius? No?
No, I don't.
Okay, all right, okay. All right, okay. All right, enough with my jokes, right? Okay. All right, let's keep, I think I'm still sharing the screen here. All right, so let's talk about some other properties. There is a tilt in our, we orbit the Earth. We also rotate every day around as we, at the equator spins at a certain speed. Our planet is on a certain axial tilt. This allows for the seasons that we enjoy as we make our journey, 1 year journey around the sun. If it was some number different than 23 and a half, so our temperatures would be intolerable for human life to exist. And so these are just some things that I wanted to share with you and thought that you might find interesting. But of course, a lot more could be said about the fine-tuning nature of the world in which we live. But I wanted to share with you just a few of these things that, again, you can use these in discussion with other people. And all right, so let's just imagine, if things were altered just a little bit. Like, it's not that we are a bit uncomfortable, it's that we can't live here at all, right? And that's what some of these things are pointing to. And so many physical, geology and in astronomy and in biology and all these different sciences are, we're really, in science, we're really dealing with God's handiwork. You look at the way the body can heal. And one of the most dangerous points in a cancer patient's life is when you take their white cells down. So, my dad, he had acute myeloid leukemia. And when, if you were to have a bone marrow transplant, what they do is they take your immune system down to like 0. So if you get an infection, then it could kill you, because most of us have a healthy white count, that white cells, fight off infection. But if you take that immune system down to 0 right before the bone, during a bone marrow transplant, and a person gets an infection, they have no ability to fight it. You can transfuse red cells, but white cells can't really be, from what I know, transfused. And so, we operate sometimes on a fragile margins, but life does exist, and we thank God for that. So let me flip over now to my notes, and that's all for for that. Let me see if there's anything that I've left out on the design argument. So essentially, when we talk about arguing for a design, having a designer, we're talking about, just point out some facet of our natural world and say, does that exhibit design? And so if we can see design in our world, we can certainly realize that there is a designer. Let me go on now to the next portion. And there's a little more information in the notes, but I've covered the majority of it there for you tonight. Let me share with you a different screen. And in our notes, we are on page 64. And again, you can get those in that document on that I've shared with you there. So if anybody needs access to that again, or you need some help finding that, let me know. I want you to have all the materials and be able to use them in a way that's helpful. So, all right, so one way I can reason to the existence of God is through the cause and effect argument, right? Does something come from nothing? All right. And how did that something get here? Another way I can reason with people is through the design argument, that if the world shows design, that demands a designer. Well, a third way that we could reason with people on the existence of God is called the moral argument for the existence of God. This is a little bit different than those other two. And again, there are multiple arguments that could be put forward for proofs for God's existence. And so if evil is real, right, then there must of necessity be something that is not evil, that is, something that's good. It's not the case that everything is evil, but if there is evil and good, then there must be a standard to determine evil and good. If there's a standard, there must be a standard giver. So notice that you can reason from evil in our world to the existence of God as the standard giver of all morality. So let's take this kind of line by line. So we've got two options for evil in our world. Is evil real, or is evil merely an illusion? Now, there are some groups in our world that believe that evil is merely an illusion. You look at certain Christian scientists and Hindus, they argue that evil is not real. They argue that it's an illusion. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to convince people that the evil is real. And, you can look around Warner Robins, you can read the headlines, you can see the murders and the rapes and all the things going on in our own communities, and see evil. A few moments on television or on the news, and you can see that evil is going on in our society. Our legal system goes to great lengths to bring justice to so many evils in our world. Police speed quickly across town to deal with evil, and so this notion of evil is something that's real in our world. I won't spend a lot of time talking about that. But if you were to ask somebody, just like Warren did with flu, was Hitler's killing of 6 million Jews in Nazi Germany, was that real moral evil? Was that evil, or was that merely an illusion? Now, Richard Weikart is a historian who's written this. He said, how could a mass murderer like Hitler have had any ethic? Yet surprisingly, the fanaticism that motivated him to pursue mass killing and many other policies stemmed at least in part from his sincerely held but pernicious conviction that killing people he deemed inferior would serve a higher moral purpose, advancing the human species and evolutionary process. It's hard to imagine that Hitler had any ethics, right? But Hitler believed that if he killed off the inferior races, that he was somehow doing humanity a benefit. Now, this evolutionary ethic was central to Hitler's ideology and practice, because ultimately Hitler measured every policy by its effect on biological improvement. We ought not to think that these notions that are godless at their core, like Darwinism, we ought not to think that has no impact on society. Ideas have consequences. What you believe about other people will impact the way that you behave towards other people. And in Hitler's case, it will impact the way that you allow them to live or die. And so, Weikart has written a book called Hitler's Ethic. And he talks about some of this aspect of what was going on historically. Important point to recognize is that evolutionary ethics, scientific racism, eugenics, and many related ideas were considered mainstream scientific ideas before and during the Nazi regime, even though they were contested. Many leading scientists and physicians, and not just in Germany, believe that morality is a result of evolution, that behavior was determined by one's hereditary characteristics, and that some races had higher ethical tendencies than others. Many leading anthropologists in Germany by the early 20th century believed that Europeans were mentally and morally superior to inferior races such as Black Africans, American Indians, or Australian Aborigines. Some included Jews in the category of hereditary inferior races. If we want to, I mean, let's not whitewash history here. WRCOC goes on to say, he says some scientists and physicians not only cooperated with the Nazi compulsory sterilization program for the disabled and half blacks, but they also supported and participated in killing the disabled Jews and gypsies. Scholars rallied to the Nazi regime's call for experts to racially categorize people so they could determine their fitness for surviving, marrying, and or reproducing. Life and death was in the hands of the scientists and physicians who sometimes even went beyond the regime's directive in committing atrocities. Most of them apparently thought, just as Hitler did, that their actions were morally justified since they were contributing to the progress of the human species. I want us to know that in what happened in Nazi Germany happened because people bought in to certain notions that were godless at their core and that destroyed humanity. Now, if we think that evolution and the implications of evolution are somehow sterile from the destruction of humanity, I want to remind us that there is a powerful lesson from 80 years that's screaming out to us that, hey, you know what? These notions of social Darwinism are at their core led to death and destruction and the dehumanizing of people and death at so many turns. And so I don't want us to lose, we don't want to sanitize history. Joseph Mengele was a Nazi physician. He was sometimes referred to as Uncle Mengele. It was reported that Mengele gave injections into children's eyes because he wanted to study their eye color. He was also interested in studying twins. And once Mengele, he rounded up 14 pairs of twins during the night. He placed them on polished marble dissection tables and he put them to sleep. He then injected into their hearts chloroform and he killed them instantly. He then began to dissect and meticulously noting pieces of the bodies of the twins. He also reported, it's also reported that he had a keen interest in conjoined twins and that he would sew them together. So notice that Mengele was a Nazi physician. He was doing all sorts of horrendous things to other people. So when you begin to believe that certain people are inferior, there's no telling what you will end up doing to them. Now, what's going to stop it, right? What's going to stop people like Hitler? Where are those beliefs going to come from? In the Tuskegee case in 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service began a syphilis experiment in Macon County, Alabama, that showed the highest syphilis rate in 6 counties surveyed. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted infection or disease caused by a bacteria that when it goes untreated, it goes through various stages. The last stage of syphilis can infect the heart. You can end up with inflammatory tumors. So there were 400 Black men who participated in this study. It was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service. And the issue is that penicillin was available to treat syphilis, and these men were forbidden from that drug that could help them. So this disease went untreated in these men. They were denied informed consent. They were lied to. They were treated as less than human. This study continued from 1932 all the way to 1972. So we would ask the question, was it real evil to deny these Black men informed consent? They were treated like lab rats. They weren't given medical treatment when that medical treatment was available. And I'm certainly not a giant Bill Clinton fan. I certainly don't condone all he did in his life. But in 1997, he made a formal apology to the Tuskegee men on behalf of the U.S. government for how they were treated. And we're asking the question, is this real moral evil? Is this, or is this merely an illusion? We could look in Rwanda in Africa, where 800,000 of a tribe of the Tutsis were killed by the Hutus. Some were blown up in churches, some were chopped with machetes. We could go on and on. We could look at Willowbrook State Hospital in the 1950s, where individuals were taken in Staten Island, New York. And here, 5,000 residents, 3,800 of them had severely mental disabilities. And they were given diseases like hepatitis and measles and parasitic infections. And they were treated as less than humans, and they would do research studies on them and things of that nature. They tried to justify the treatment of them in the fact that the parents consented and the hepatitis was rampant among all rampant among many of those in the hospital. But they were treating them, people with disabilities, as less than human. And we want to ask this question: is that real evil to take vulnerable people and to treat them as if they're animals, and or is evil merely an illusion? And so we could go on and on with different facets of evil that exists in our world. But I want us to see, let me share one other thing with you. There was a physician in Bolivar, Missouri by the name of Dr. N. Denny Crisp, and he was charged with inappropriately touching his patients, right? So we would ask the question, is it real moral evil for a doctor to inappropriately touch his patient? All of us here tonight would admit that. But the reason why I keep saying and going back to instance after instance is sometimes people will deny the existence of God because they'll see so much evil in the world. But I'm saying that the moment that people admit evil in the world, then we have a pathway to try to teach them about the nature of God. How do we do it? Well, if there's real evil in the world, then there must be good. If there's real evil and good in the world, there's a standard by which to judge good and evil. If there's a standard by which to judge good or evil, there must be a standard giver. So we see that some answers don't suffice for morality in our world. What I mean is that when we look at Germany and we say, okay, killing 6 million Jews would be outlawed in the US, we wouldn't approve of that. And then we look among the Allied powers and we say, okay, let's pull some nations together. Let's pull Great Britain and America together. And we would say, well, these two nations would oppose what's going on in Germany. But here's the thing. Germany is not under US law. It's not under Allied law. It's under German law. Well, what's going to sit in judgment of the offenses, of the crimes against humanity that existed in Germany? Well, they're not in the US. They're not in Great Britain. They're not under Allied powers. They have their own laws. They have their own rules. Well, what made these individuals criminals and what determined them as being criminal was a law that transcended Germany, a law that was greater than Germany. And individuals were put to death because of the violations against humanity. And so when we talk about evil, it's important that in classes like this that we stop for just a moment and talk about evil. What do we mean by evil? Well, the Bible will describe evil in various ways. So when we talk about evil, we can talk about evil from a couple different perspectives. Those of you at Warner Robins will remember this passage from Sunday. We use that in the lesson. The question was asked, teacher, what is the great commandment in the law? So here's a Jew trying to put Jesus on the spot. Jesus answered him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So real, genuine evil in our world is failing either to love God or failing to love our fellow man. Failing to love God is to fail to be, and this is a word that Warren uses, filial. Failing to love our fellow man is unfraternal. So you're familiar with the word fraternity. It's a brotherhood, right? Or a sorority, you know, it's a sisterhood, so to speak. So if we fail to love God, that's real evil. If we fail to love each other or our fellow man, that's real evil. It should be noted, though, that some evil in the Bible has various uses. Evil can be used as an adjective for a particular generation, this evil generation. It can be used as a noun referring to sin. You meant evil against me. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, in the discussion about Joseph, he says to his brothers, you meant it, you meant it for, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. And so they sinned against Joseph in selling him into slavery, eventually ends up in Egypt. But God's able to take situations that are unfortunate and allow good to come because of that. It's a descriptive term meaning suffering or oppression. Moses asked God, why have you done evil to this people? What's he talking about? He's talking about suffering under Pharaoh's oppressive rule. So evil can be used in various ways in the Bible. It can mean a moral option or choice given the existence of free will. Choose for you this day who you will serve, whether it be good, whether it be evil. So evil can be used in that way. Now, another aspect of evil that we need to talk about is what's called intrinsic evil. Intrinsic evil is evil that's evil in and of itself, and it's always evil under every circumstance. It never can be right under any circumstance. Instrumental evil, on the other hand, is that which hinders, either us loving God or us loving our neighbor. For example, if a person were to ask, is sex good, right? Is sex morally permissible in God's eyes? Is it acceptable? Well, it depends, right? Is it sex between a man and a woman? Is it sex between a man and a woman who are married honorably in God's eyes? So sex instrumentally can be good. Sex instrumentally can be evil. There are certain circumstances that have to be weighed to determine if sex is morally righteous in God's eyes. Another example would be the example of eating meat offered to idols. Instrumentally, eating meat offered to idols, 1 Corinthians 8, Romans 14, eating meat offered to idols, instrumentally could be evil. Well, when, Paul? Well, if it's causing your brother to stumble, then you would abstain from eating that, Paul, he goes through this discussion, that an idol is nothing. But if it causes your brother to stumble, then you would abstain from, eventually your brother should come around to understanding that an idol is not, so instrumentally, the eating of meat could be good, right? Nourishment to the body. It's simply meat, that an idol is nothing, but certain circumstances would play into the decision of whether it's moral and upright or whether it's evil. So we've got intrinsic evil. This is sin. It's always wrong under every circumstance to not love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. There's never a time when that's acceptable. Same thing with your brother or your sister. You must always love them. And in the ethics class, we go into this a little bit, but these are two questions that you can ask. When you're at a crossroads and you're really wrestling with a decision, ask yourself this question: how does this influence my relationship with God? Does this draw me closer to God, or does it draw me further from him? And then ask about your neighbor. Does this harm my neighbor some way? Does this help my neighbor get to heaven? Or does this create a stumbling block for my neighbor? So, when you stand at a crossroads and you're asking questions, should I do this or should I do that? Should I go to the right? Should I go to the left? What should I do? You can ask those two moral questions. So when we talk about evil, it's important that we kind of qualify. Now, sometimes people talk about evil from natural circumstances. For example, sometimes we talk about calamities. Here's a tornado, here's a tsunami, here's an earthquake, here's a landslide, here's a dust storm, here's hail. Here's some natural force that occurs in our world. And sometimes people refer to that as evil. Well, it's not necessarily evil that this suffering exists. God allows that suffering. God does allow physical suffering. Some physical suffering is the result of sin, but that doesn't mean that it's evil that this suffering exists. Some suffering exists because it's part of living in a world that's free. And Sister Margaret mentioned a few moments ago, if you were going to make a decision to step out in front of a truck, God doesn't suspend everybody's free will to preserve your life. He allows certain things. It's part of living. We can't live in a free world that's not free at certain times that are just advantageous to us. And because we live in a free world, we're going to be impacted by sin. We're going to be impacted and suffer the consequences of our own sin. We're going to be impacted by the consequences of other people's sin. But some people refer to what happens in these natural things, natural events, as if they're evil. And so we need to make a distinction between God certainly allows suffering to exist, and it's not evil that he allows suffering to exist. He's not somehow evil because this suffering, natural suffering, will occur. And so we could say a lot more about that, but I think it's important. He brings out that in one of his books. And, if God had not spared Daniel and the lions, if God had not spared Daniel, he would have been ripped to shred and eaten by lions. But the lions aren't somehow morally culpable. They're not somehow morally blameworthy if they were to eat humans. I mean, they're animals, right? And so if when a lion goes out and kills a wildebeest, the lion doesn't sit there, a few hours later and go, wow, I can't believe I did that. They don't feel like moral guilt. They're not, they're designed a certain way, and that's how they live. And so, some suffering in life is the result of sin, but not all suffering is. Tom Warren talks about this a little bit more in his book on Have the Atheists Prove There Is No God? And here's what he says, and I just want to talk to you a little bit about that. I think it's helpful. Vital to this problem in the discussion of the biblical view is that God created man for sonship and for brotherhood, for recognition of his fatherhood and for fellowship with him. Second, whatever is filial, that is loving God, and fraternal, that's love of a brother. Whatever involves this recognition of the fatherhood of God, truly involves fellowship with God, is intrinsically good. Whatever human action is in harmony with the will of God is intrinsically good and can never, under any circumstance, be either intrinsically or instrumentally evil. So he goes through, these are kind of some philosophical definitions, but he's drawing the distinction between intrinsic evil and instrumental evil. So here's the thing: whatever helps sonship and brotherhood is instrumentally good. whatever hinders sonship and brotherhood is instrumentally evil. And so if there are certain behaviors or certain considerations that are tearing down our brothers, how do we, then those, running them through that test, make it easier to make those decisions. So what else he says is, no mere object, no mere event, no living thing which is subhuman can be intrinsically evil. What does he mean? Okay, so we talk about a tsunami that kills a bunch of people, or a hurricane, or flooding, or something of that nature. Well, is it unfortunate? Sure. Are we sad that it happened? Absolutely. Do we go to try to help people that are in those circumstances? We should try. But is it evil that those things happen? So notice he's very narrow in his definition of evil, because he understands that sometimes philosophers say that if a flood happens and people die because of the flood, that somehow God is implicated and bad because he allows floods to happen, or hurricanes, or tsunamis, or dust storms, or car wrecks, and things of that nature. Well, part of this is part of living in a free world. And so it's important that that we define evil in such a way that, or look to the Bible and its definition. All of these definitions, by the way, are in harmony with Scripture. And so this is something I think that's helpful in this argument. So let me share with you, in the few moments we have left tonight, let me share with you several moral arguments for the existence of God. And I've shared with you kind of a basic one. And this, if you're taking the class for credit, this is what I want you to memorize, right? All right. If evil exists, something good exists. If something evil and good exists, there's a standard by which to evaluate what's good and evil. If there's a standard by which to evaluate what's good and evil, there is of necessity a standard giver. And that standard giver, we would argue, is God. So you move from, and you could start with the existence of good. Is there real goodness that exists in our world? When a young daughter hugs her father's neck and tells her dad she loves him, is that good? Right? Okay. Is everything that everybody does good? No. All right. Some things people do are evil. All right. So let's think about a few of them. All right. Here's some, let's flip on the news. Okay. 30 seconds in. All right. We've got all sorts of evil there. All right. So does that make sense? And arguing from the existence of evil to the existence of God, is that clear? I want to make sure that at a very basic level that we understand that. Anyone need further explanation or clarification? Okay, well, if you do, raise your hand. I don't see any thing in the chat, but if you need me to explain things, I'll be happy to do that. Okay, so let's talk about a few of these arguments tonight, and you can see them here on the screen. If there is universal evil, that's evil that would be evil in all places everywhere, as determined by a universal standard, there is a universal standard giver that exists. So here's one argument. Universal evil exists, that is, there's evil that's evil everywhere in all places at all times. Universal evil is determined by a universal standard. A universal standard must have a standard giver. Therefore, a universal standard giver must exist. So there would be more basic ways you could describe this. But we could think about some of the evil that we've addressed tonight. Think about the things in Rwanda. You think about the tragedies with Tuskegee. You think about, what Hitler did in Germany, and just ask people, hey, is that evil? All right, okay. Upon what basis do you judge that to be evil? Well, I just feel that it's wrong, or I know that it's illegal, or something like that. Okay, well, is it wrong merely because it happened in Germany? Well, no, it would be wrong if we murdered 6 million of our own people. That would be wrong too. Well, why would it be wrong? In Germany, it was legal, right? They were setting forth a law that would, so merely saying, well, it would be wrong because it's illegal. We're saying what sits in judgment of the law. And so this is a way that we could reason there. If we were to look in 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, let me share with you that passage here. So probably not the biggest print for you there, but it's probably a passage you're familiar with. It says, all scripture is breathed out by God and is profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. All right. So all scripture. Okay. You look at the word scripture, it refers to the word writings. Peter makes a reference that to Paul's writings being scripture, and some of those are hard to understand, difficult to understand. So all scripture is given by God. It's breathed out. What does it do? It teaches, it reproves, it corrects, it trains. And it causes man to be complete, equipped for every good work. So here, scripture is guiding us along moral lines. If you ask the question, how do I know if this is a good thing to do or an evil thing to do? Well, scripture would be one of those ways. But an atheist or an unbeliever or an agnostic may not accept the Bible's testimony concerning what's good or evil. So what Warren did in his debate with Flew is he said, okay, you won't let me reason with the Bible. I'll reason outside of the Bible, and then let's see how you answer these questions. So the Bible is the standard, and that's what we're arguing in this class, is the Bible is the ultimate standard of morality that's revealed to us by God. So we're thinking, and then, I want to kind of summarize this and bring it to a head about where we've reasoned so far in this class. And I won't read the rest of these notes. In other words, the rest of these notes here, there's the C.S. Lewis moral argument, and I just share with you some of those for your own understanding. So there are various moral arguments. They come in different ways. I gave you kind of the basic one. That's the one, if you're taking the class for credit, I'll test you on. You don't have to memorize all these other ones, but here's some other information that might be helpful. If you want to dig in a little bit deeper, here's some information that'll help you. So let's back up, and in the few minutes we have left of the class, let's talk about where we are. Let's talk about the practical, where the rubber meets the road, and how we use this information, right? So I'm not saying that you sit down and read these notes to somebody, but they're welcome to, and maybe they would help. But when you take this information and you put legs on it, here's what it's going to look like, right? Can I know truth? Can I know that there is something in this world that's called truth? And can I know the difference between truth and error? So we've talked in the class so far about correspondence, truth, and how do we know what truth is? And how do we know if there's a truth that's objective? Okay. And so we said that there's real truth that exists in our world. Not everything is created by us. Some people say, well, people make up their own truths, and they make up their own facts, and they make up their own way of understanding. But we see that our world doesn't operate that way. If you go to a bank and you look at you want them to tell you how much you have in your checking account, you don't want them to have their own definitions of money or their own definitions of numbers or their own definition of you know, you want fairness, you want equity, you want, if there's $100 in your bank account, you don't want them to say, yeah, but you know, 100 can mean a lot of different things to different people, right? We understand our world operates on understand, you know, if you go to a green light, if you're following traffic patterns in Warner Robins or Fort Valley or wherever you live, you don't want to come up to a traffic light and go, you know, today my definition of red is go. You know, everybody creates their own truth, right? And so my definition of red means that I can proceed through the intersection. You're going to hurt somebody, right? Our world operates that there is such a thing as truth, and truth certainly exists in our world. We can't just make it all up, and it's not just a product of our own minds. There is actually real objective truth that exists in our world. So can you know truth? Yes, truth corresponds to reality. And so we talked about that. Then we talked about the existence of God. How do we know that God exists? We know that God exists through cause and effect. Does something come from nothing? Well, something's here. How do I explain that? Right? If something exists and something doesn't come from nothing, every effect must have a cause. Right? And I can't go back endlessly, infinitely, and say that there is no, because what I see is a successive cause after cause. I see effect after effect after effect after effect, and that just like dominoes, that when you start when you push down the first domino, there will be subsequent effects all the way around as those dominoes fall. So the cosmological argument is one of a cause and effect argument. We can reason from effect to a sufficient cause. We can't say that you know, the world and the world in which we live is the product of, you know, inferior understanding or inferior intelligence, right? I mean, we wouldn't say, well, a reasonable explanation for our world is unintelligent aliens, right? I mean, that would be, that wouldn't make good sense. But we can look around our world and say, okay, cause and effect. And so then we talked about the design argument. Can we see design in our world, and does that demonstrate for us that there must be a designer? And then we looked at fine-tuning principles in our world, and we see that, hey, there's so many laws, there's so many physical constants, there's so many precise things that are held in such a way that they demonstrate that life is finely tuned in our world for human life to exist. You know, when you think about conception, and a woman ovulates, typically one ovary ovulates in her fertile period once a month, right? So her ovaries, one ovary will ovulate this month, the opposite ovary typically will ovulate the next month. It'll be a 28-day cycle. The moment she ovulates, there's an egg that's released, and there is an egg that's released, and then the fallopian tubes will go and grab that egg. That egg will travel down a fallopian tube that's about the size of a human hair. It will enter the uterus, and it's got to be fertilized within 12 to 24 hours. So all of us here, unless there's a test tube baby here, all of us that are here tonight had a window of opportunity from 12 to 24 hours where that egg had to be fertilized. If it didn't happen in that window of time, the egg would pass through the body of the female. There would be no fertilization. There's all sorts of contingencies. There's all sorts of competition as the sperm head to that egg, but there's only a 12 to 24 hour window of time. Like your life doesn't begin unless fertilization happens in specific, precise ways. We don't have the opportunity for, well, 38 hours, 40 hours, right? 12 to 24 is that lifespan of that egg, from what I know. I just want to see that sometimes you look at life and you see that life occurs, and it seems like on a, in very precise windows open at very specific times, and life is beautiful when it begins. And I want us to see that there's so much in our world tonight that are crying out to us that you can know truth and you can know that God exists. And I don't want my boys to grow up thinking that science is an enemy. I want them to love the natural world. I want them to love being in it. I want them to see God in the sunrises, not seeing him face to face, but seeing his handiwork and so much that is around us. And so this is where we're at in the class right now. And I want you to see that we've moved through these two areas, and Lord willing, next week, let me see what's on the menu in the lunchroom. And so, yeah, we're doing pretty good. We did talk about fine-tuning principles tonight. Next week, we'll talk a little bit more about science in the Bible, and we'll get in, well, we may be a little bit ahead, actually. So we'll see. Sometimes I get long-winded. Any questions or comments, observations tonight before we end with a prayer? I appreciate so much you guys being in here tonight, both men and women and children. I appreciate all of you and your time, and appreciate you sitting through it. I know there's a lot of things you could be doing on a Tuesday night, and some of this gets maybe a little hairy. I hope that it's I put it in ways that are helpful to you, and certainly am open to trying to help any of you on these issues. We love you. We love the church. We love God, and realize that this is a great opportunity to try to teach and reach some of our young people. And if there's anything I can do to help you guys, I'd be happy to do that. Appreciate you all being here. Let's end with a prayer. Holy Father, we're thankful for this time together, and we're thankful, Lord, for the blessings of knowing that you exist. We know in Hebrews 11 that you talk about the essential nature of faith, and that we must believe that you exist, that God exists, and that you're a rewarder of those that diligently seek you. We seek you, Lord, and we thank you for giving us so much information. We're thankful for filling our hearts with the joy of your knowledge and understanding. We pray, God, that you may open up doors of opportunity so that we may share your beautiful truths with other people who need them. We're thankful for the gospel, the way that it empowers our lives, the way that it gives us wisdom and insight, the way it helps us to understand the difference between right and wrong. We're thankful, Lord, for the fellowship that we enjoy in Christ Jesus. We're thankful for good brethren all over the world, and individuals who are taking your light into places where we could not speak the language, and where we would not know the people, and we would not understand the culture. But we know, Lord, that you're able to work in those areas through your vessels, individuals who are preaching and proclaiming your gospel. We're so thankful for these people that are lighting fires in those communities. Be with us, Lord, as we strive to serve you. Be with those that are brokenhearted tonight because of the loss of loved ones. Be with those that are dealing with physical ailments and spiritual struggles, and we know that you know them best. We rely on your power and your strength. Be with us and bless us, Lord. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Have a good night, everyone. Love you guys.
Thank you, Brother Daniel. Thank you very kindly.
You're welcome.
Night, night.
Thank you for the class.
Good
Yeah.
night.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
very good class.
Thanks, Daniel. It was great. It was great.
It
Thank you
reminded
so
me
much.
of our digging deep when we did the glory lesson and we talked about God's glory and creation, and we got so into that. And you just reminded me so much of that wonderful glory of God. It was just awesome listening to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sheila. I appreciate you. Okay, well, everyone have a good night, and we'll catch up with you